Nurse freezes up seeing millionaire patient is son, who disappeared 30 years ago. The private hospital bustled with the controlled chaos Zoe Matthews knew so well. The rhythmic beeping of machines, the chatter of nurses exchanging reports, and the faint scent of antiseptic were constants in her world. But today felt different. An unspoken tension hung in the air, carried by hushed conversations and sideways glances. Zoe, ever observant, caught snippets as she moved through the hallways. VIP patient, one nurse whispered to another. Oliver Grant, the reclusive billionaire. I heard he's critical, someone else murmured. Doctors are saying it's touch and go. Zoe didn't pay much attention at first. High-profile patients were no rarity in a hospital of this caliber. It wasn't until the assignment landed on her desk that her pulse quickened. Her name was clearly marked at the top of the patient care sheet. Beneath it, the name, Oliver Grant. The familiarity struck her like a lightning bolt. It wasn't the name itself, but the date of birth listed below it, matching the same year her son, Theo, had disappeared 3 decades ago. Zoe's hands trembled slightly as she scanned the file, her sharp mind piecing together fragments of memory. It couldn't be, could it? Taking a steadying breath, she closed the file and made her way to the private wing. Her mind swirled with questions, each one heavier than the last. Could this Oliver Grant truly be her long-lost son? If it was him, why hadn't he come back? Why was his name different? And most painfully, what if he didn't remember her at all? Zoe paused outside the door to Oliver's suite, her hand hovering over the handle. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the faint outline of a man lying on the hospital bed, machines surrounding him. She steeled herself, pushing down the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Right now, she was Nurse Matthews, a professional dedicated to providing care. Whatever personal questions loomed would have to wait. When Zoe entered the room, her breath hitched. The man lying in the bed was pale and gaunt, his face marked by the shadows of fatigue and illness. But it was his features that caught her. The curve of his jaw, the high cheekbones, and a faint scar above his left temple. It was him. It had to be. Oliver's eyes fluttered open, and he stared at her with a guarded expression. His voice, though weak, carried an edge. Who are you? Zoe's heart raced, but her voice remained calm and professional. I'm Nurse Matthews. I'll be looking after you during your stay. Oliver gave a slight nod, his suspicion evident. You've been briefed, I assume? Of course, Zoe replied, keeping her tone steady. We're here to ensure your recovery. She checked his vitals, her hands steady, even as her emotions churned beneath the surface. As she worked, Oliver's sharp gaze followed her every move, scrutinizing her as though searching for something he couldn't name. Zoe could feel his distrust, but knew better than to push. Over the next few days, Zoe maintained her professionalism, caring for Oliver with the same diligence she gave every patient. Yet every interaction was laced with a quiet tension, the weight of unspoken truths pressing on her chest. Oliver was curt and distant, his demeanor suggesting a man unaccustomed to vulnerability. Zoe couldn't help but notice the small details that connected him to the boy she had lost. The way his left hand twitched slightly when he was agitated, the way his eyes narrowed when he was deep in thought. But there were differences, too. Oliver was closed off, his walls firmly in place, and Zoe knew that breaching them would be no easy task. One evening, Zoe arrived for her shift to find Oliver sitting up in bed, his laptop open in front of him. Despite his weakened state, his fingers moved deftly across the keyboard, his focus unbroken. She hesitated at the door, not wanting to intrude, but Oliver noticed her presence and looked up. "You're punctual," he remarked, closing the laptop. "I appreciate that." Zoe offered a small smile. "It's part of the job." Oliver studied her for a moment, before speaking again. "You've been quiet. Most nurses chatter endlessly. You don't. Why?" Zoe met his gaze, her heart pounding. "I prefer to listen." "Interesting," Oliver said, leaning back against the pillows. "You must hear a lot." "I do," Zoe replied, "but I also understand that some things are better left unsaid." Oliver's lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but it faded quickly. Wise words. Their conversations remained sparse, but each interaction gave Zoe a glimpse of the man Oliver had become. He was brilliant, sharp, and fiercely independent, yet there was an underlying loneliness she recognized all too well. It was the same loneliness she had carried for years, the ache of something, or someone, missing. As the days passed, Zoe began piecing together bits of Oliver's life through their brief conversations and the medical staff's updates. He had been adopted by a wealthy family after being found abandoned, his upbringing shrouded in secrecy. His health issues were the result of years of unchecked stress and grueling work, compounded by a genetic condition that required constant monitoring. Zoe's heart ached as she listened, each detail confirming what she already knew. This was her son, the boy she had searched for in vain, now a man she barely recognized. The urge to tell him the truth burned within her, but she held back. Oliver's health was fragile, and the last thing she wanted was to overwhelm him with revelations that could derail his recovery. One night, as Zoe prepared to leave for the evening, she paused outside Oliver's room, her hand resting on the doorframe. Inside, she could hear the faint sound of his voice as he spoke on the phone. "I don't want anyone else in here," Oliver said, his tone clipped. "She's the only one I trust." Zoe's breath caught, her chest tightening. The weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing day, but she knew she had to wait for the right moment. For now, she would continue caring for him, hoping that time would provide the answers she so desperately needed. Zoe's routine remained steady, though her inner turmoil grew with each passing day. Every shift brought her closer to Oliver, yet the gap between who he was and who she remembered widened. She kept her emotions carefully tucked away, her focus remaining on his care and recovery. One afternoon, while monitoring Oliver's vitals, she noticed him studying her. His intense gaze made her pause, though she continued to work with practiced precision. "You don't talk about yourself," Oliver said suddenly, his voice laced with curiosity. "Why is that?" Zoe hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. "I'm here for you, Mr. Grant. My personal life isn't important." Oliver smirked faintly. "That's a convenient answer, but everyone has a story, Nurse Matthews. What's yours?" Her grip tightened on the edge of the bed frame, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "My story is that I care for patients and do my best to help them recover. That's all that matters." Oliver raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press further. Instead, he leaned back against the pillows, his expression unreadable. Fair enough. The brief exchange lingered in Zoe's mind as she left his room. She knew Oliver's questions came from a place of curiosity, but they cut deeper than she cared to admit. How could she explain her story without unraveling the carefully constructed facade she had built around herself? Later that evening, Zoe found herself reviewing his medical file again. She didn't need to. She had memorized every detail, but it gave her something to focus on, besides the storm of emotions raging within her. The notes confirmed what she already suspected. Oliver's health was improving, but his condition remained delicate. Stress could easily set him back, and she couldn't afford to jeopardize his recovery. Still, the urge to tell him the truth gnawed at her. She thought back to the day he disappeared, the police searches, and the sleepless nights that followed. She had clung to hope for years, imagining countless scenarios where they would reunite. But in none of those scenarios had her son grown into a man who didn't recognize her. The next morning, Zoe arrived early for her shift, determined to approach the day with a clear head. As she entered Oliver's room, she noticed a framed photograph on the bedside table. It was the first personal item she had seen him display since his admission. Oliver caught her glance and followed her gaze to the photo. "It's my adoptive parents," he said, his tone neutral. "They passed a few years ago." Zoe studied the image, a man and woman, both impeccably dressed, standing with a young boy who looked stiff and formal. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "They gave me everything," Oliver continued, his voice quieter now. "Opportunities, resources, a name, but they weren't exactly warm." Zoe frowned, carefully choosing her words. "That must have been difficult," Oliver shrugged. "It taught me independence. I learned not to rely on anyone." His words stung, though Zoe hid her reaction. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that he had once been surrounded by love, but the walls he had built were impenetrable. Instead, she focused on the present, adjusting his IV and ensuring his comfort. That afternoon, Zoe overheard a conversation between two doctors discussing Oliver's case. They mentioned his childhood health records, noting gaps in the documentation. Intrigued, Zoe made a note to follow up later, knowing the answers she sought might lie in those missing years. When her shift ended, Zoe lingered in the staff lounge, scrolling through the hospital's database. Her access as a senior nurse allowed her to review archived records, though she knew she was towing the line of professional ethics. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was within reach. After hours of searching, she found a file linked to Oliver's birth year. The details were sparse, but one note stood out. A medical evaluation performed on a 7-year-old boy, found abandoned at a train station. The boy's name was listed as Theo, though it had been crossed out and replaced with Oliver Grant. Zoe's hands trembled as she read the words. This was the confirmation she had been waiting for, the proof that her instincts had been right all along. Her son had been taken, renamed, and raised in a world she had no access to. That night, sleep eluded her. The revelation had brought both relief and anguish, and she wrestled with how to proceed. If she told Oliver the truth, would he believe her? Or would he see her as an intruder, disrupting the life he had built? The next day, Zoe returned to work with a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't keep the secret forever, but she also couldn't risk Oliver's health by overwhelming him. For now, she would continue caring for him, hoping that the right moment would present itself. As she entered Oliver's room, she noticed him sitting upright, his laptop open on the tray table. He looked up as she approached, his expression less guarded than usual. "Good morning," Oliver said, his tone almost friendly. "Good morning," Zoe replied, checking his vitals. "You're looking better today." Oliver nodded, closing the laptop. "I feel better, thanks to you." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. But as Zoe prepared to leave the room, Oliver's next words stopped her in her tracks. "You seem familiar," he said, his brow furrowed. "Have we met before?" Zoe's heart raced, her carefully composed exterior threatening to crack. "No," she said quickly. "I don't think so." Oliver studied her, his gaze searching. "Strange. I could swear." Zoe forced a smile, cutting him off. "It's probably just a coincidence. I'll check back later." As she left the room, her mind raced. Oliver's words had shaken her, but they also gave her hope. Perhaps, on some level, he did remember her. If that were true, maybe there was a chance to bridge the gap between them. For now, Zoe resolved to take things one day at a time. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and when the moment came, she would be ready. Zoe paced the small break room, her thoughts circling like a relentless storm. She had uncovered the truth she had sought for decades, but now the burden of what to do with it weighed heavier than ever. Her every instinct as a nurse told her to prioritize Oliver's recovery above all else. Yet the mother in her longed to reach out, to tell him the truth, to bridge the chasm of 30 lost years. The following day, she entered Oliver's room with her usual composure, though her heart was anything but steady. Oliver was sitting up, his laptop closed and a distant expression on his face. His gaze shifted to her as she walked in, his brow furrowing slightly. "You always seem deep in thought," he said. "What keeps you so focused?" Zoe hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I'm focused on making sure you're comfortable," she replied, deflecting. Oliver smirked faintly. "You're good at that. Too good, maybe. You remind me of someone, though I can't quite place it." Her breath hitched, but she kept her tone steady. "I'm sure I'm just one of many nurses you've encountered over the years." Oliver shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "It's not that. There's something familiar, like a memory just out of reach." Zoe quickly busied herself with checking his IV, the weight of his words pressing on her. She wanted to tell him that the familiarity he felt wasn't imagined, that it was the bond between a mother and her child, buried under years of separation, but the risk of overwhelming him held her back. As the days passed, Oliver began to lower his guard, engaging with Zoe in ways he hadn't before. He asked about her life, her career, and the moments that had shaped her. Zoe answered carefully, always keeping the conversation focused on him. Yet she couldn't help but let small truths slip through. Details about her love of reading, her habit of gardening, and her favorite jazz musician, all things she had shared with Theo when he was a boy. One afternoon, as Zoe adjusted Oliver's bedding, he spoke suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. "Did you ever lose someone?" The question startled her, and she turned to find him watching her intently. "Why do you ask?" she managed. "Because you carry it," Oliver said, his gaze unwavering. "That kind of pain. I see it." Zoe swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. "I lost someone a long time ago," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone very important to me." Oliver nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. Loss has a way of shaping us. For a moment, the room was filled with a heavy silence, the unspoken truths between them hanging in the air. Zoe wanted to say more, to tell him everything, but the fear of what his reaction might be kept her silent. That evening, as Zoe prepared to leave for the night, she found herself standing outside Oliver's room, her hand hovering over the door handle. She could see him through the window, his head bowed as he typed on his laptop. The image struck her. This man, so capable and intelligent, was still the little boy she had lost. But how could she reconcile the two? The next day, Oliver experienced a sudden setback. A sharp spike in his blood pressure set off alarms, and Zoe rushed to his side. His breathing was labored, his body tense with pain. "Stay with me, Mr. Grant," she said firmly, her hands moving quickly to stabilize him. As she adjusted his oxygen mask, her instincts took over, and the words slipped out before she could stop them. "Theo, it's okay. I'm here." Oliver's eyes widened slightly at the name, but the moment passed as the medication took effect, and he drifted into a restless sleep. Zoe froze, her heart pounding. Had he hurt her? If he had, would he remember? The incident left her shaken, but she couldn't dwell on it. Her priority was ensuring Oliver's recovery, even as the weight of her secret grew heavier. Over the next few days, she noticed subtle changes in his behavior. Longer glances, questions that felt more probing, and a quiet intensity that suggested he was piecing something together. One evening, as Zoe entered his room, Oliver spoke without preamble. "Who's Theo?" Zoe's breath caught, her hands stilling on the chart she was holding. "Why do you ask?" "You said the name when I was out of it," Oliver said, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. "It's not a common name, and it felt significant." Zoe hesitated, her mind racing. She could deny it, brush it off as a mistake, but the look in Oliver's eyes told her he wouldn't accept that. Taking a deep breath, she set the chart down and met his gaze. "Theo was my son," she said softly. "He disappeared 30 years ago." Oliver's expression shifted. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossing his face. "Disappeared? What happened?" Zoe's hands clenched at her sides, the memories flooding back. "He was taken. I searched for years, but I never found him. Eventually I was told he had likely passed, but I never stopped hoping." Oliver leaned back against the pillows, his gaze distant. "And you think I'm him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Zoe's voice trembled as she answered, "I know you are. I didn't want to overwhelm you, not while you were recovering, but I'm certain. I've always been certain." Oliver's expression hardened, and he turned his head away. "You can't be serious. I've known who I am my whole life. I was raised by the Grants. They found me, took me in, gave me everything." "They gave you a name," Zoe said gently. "But they didn't give you your story. You were my son before you were theirs." The silence that followed was deafening, and Zoe's heart broke as she saw the conflict in Oliver's eyes. "You're wrong," he said finally, his voice tight. "This doesn't make sense." "I know it's a lot to process," Zoe said, her tone steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "But I have proof. Medical records, photos, things only a mother would know." Oliver shook his head, his hands gripping the edges of the blanket. Even if it's true, what does that change? You think we can just pick up where we left off? No, Zoe admitted. But it means you don't have to carry the weight of your past alone. It means you have a family, Theo. The use of his birth name seemed to strike a chord, and Oliver's eyes softened, though his expression remained guarded. I need time, he said finally. Zoe nodded, her heart aching but hopeful. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As she left the room, Zoe felt a sense of relief mingled with uncertainty. The truth was out, but the journey was far from over. For the first time in 30 years, the possibility of reconnecting with her son felt within reach, and she vowed to take each step with patience and love. Zoe's mind churned with emotion as she left Oliver's room. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. The weeks she had spent caring for him had been marked by restraint, each moment a delicate balance between her professional duties and the overpowering need to reclaim the connection she had lost. But now the barriers had been breached, and all she could do was wait. The next day, Zoe approached her shift with trepidation. As she prepared Oliver's medication, her hands trembled slightly, a reflection of the nervous anticipation that had built within her. She had no idea how he would react to seeing her again, whether he would continue the conversation they'd begun or retreat further into himself. When she entered his room, she found Oliver sitting up in bed, his laptop pushed aside. He didn't look at her immediately, his focus fixed on the window, where the afternoon sun cast golden light across the room. Zoe hesitated by the door, unsure of how to proceed. You're early, Oliver said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Zoe forced a small smile as she set the tray on the bedside table. I thought I'd check on you before the rounds got busy. Oliver finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. I've been thinking about what you said, about Theo. Zoe's breath hitched, but she kept her voice steady. I can imagine you'd have questions. Questions? Oliver let out a humorless laugh. That doesn't even begin to cover it. Do you have any idea what it's like to have your entire identity thrown into question? Zoe took a step closer, her hands clasped in front of her. I know it's overwhelming, and I don't expect you to believe me right away, but everything I've told you is the truth. Oliver leaned back against the pillows, his gaze sharp. You're asking me to accept that the life I've known, the people who raised me, the name I've carried, was built on a lie. I'm not asking you to erase what you've been through, Zoe said gently. I'm asking you to consider that there's more to your story, that you're not alone in this. Oliver's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Zoe thought he might shut her out completely. But then he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. If what you're saying is true, then I need proof. Not just words. Proof. Zoe nodded, relief washing over her. I can give you that. I have photos, records, things from when you were a boy. I'll bring them tomorrow. Oliver didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting back to the window. Fine. Tomorrow. The rest of the shift passed in relative silence, though the air between them felt less strained. Zoe left the hospital that evening, feeling a fragile sense of hope. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward. The next morning, Zoe arrived at the hospital with a small box in her hands. It was worn and scuffed, the lid slightly faded, but it contained some of her most treasured possessions. Inside were photos of Theo as a child, his favorite stuffed animal, and a copy of his birth certificate. She had kept these items safe for 30 years, a lifeline to the past she had never been able to let go of. When she entered Oliver's room, he looked up with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Zoe placed the box on the bedside table, her hands lingering on it for a moment before she stepped back. "This is everything I have," she said softly. "Take your time." Oliver opened the box slowly, his movements deliberate. The first item he pulled out was a photograph of a young boy with wide, bright eyes and a mischievous smile. Zoe's breath caught as she watched his expression shift. Confusion, recognition, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. This is me," Oliver said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember this. The swing set in the backyard." Zoe's throat tightened. "Yes, you used to call it your pirate ship." Oliver set the photo down, his fingers brushing against the stuffed animal. It was a small, worn lion with one ear slightly torn. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "I thought I'd imagined this. I used to dream about it, but I couldn't place where it came from." "It was your favorite," Zoe said, her voice trembling. "You never went anywhere without it." Oliver looked up at her, his eyes searching. "Why didn't you find me? If this is true, if you're really my mother, why didn't you come for me?" Zoe felt tears welling in her eyes, but she held his gaze. "I tried, Theo. I tried for years. But your father, he took you. He had the resources to keep you hidden, and I had no way to fight back. By the time I found out where you were, it was too late." Oliver's expression hardened, his grip tightening on the stuffed animal. "So you gave up?" "No," Zoe said firmly. "I never gave up. I kept searching, hoping, praying that one day I'd find you. And now, here you are." The room fell silent, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Oliver looked down at the items in the box, his expression conflicted. Zoe watched him, her heart aching for the boy she had lost and the man he had become. Finally, Oliver spoke, his voice quiet. "I don't know what to do with this." "You don't have to do anything right now," Zoe said. "Take your time. I'm here whenever you're ready." Oliver nodded, his eyes still fixed on the box. Zoe reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a tentative gesture that he didn't pull away from. It was a small step, but it was enough for now. As she left the room, Zoe felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, and the truth was out, and the pieces of the past were beginning to come together. But the road ahead was uncertain, and she knew it would take time to rebuild what had been lost. For now, she held on to the hope that she and Theo, Oliver, could find their way forward, together. Zoe returned to Oliver's room the following morning, uncertain of what awaited her. The small box of memories she had left with him now sat on the bedside table, its lid slightly ajar. Oliver was seated upright, his gaze distant as he absently turned the stuffed lion over in his hands. The sight made Zoe pause at the doorway, her heart heavy with both hope and fear. When Oliver finally noticed her, his expression was unreadable. "You're early," he said, his voice devoid of the sharpness that had colored so many of their previous exchanges. "I wanted to check on you," Zoe replied softly, stepping into the room. She gestured toward the lion. "I see you found Leo." Oliver's lips twitched faintly at the name. "I remember it now. Bits and pieces, at least. The backyard, the swing set. I always thought they were dreams. I didn't think they were real. They were real, Zoe said, her tone gentle. Every moment of those years was real. Oliver's gaze remained on the lion, his fingers tracing its worn fabric. And then they weren't. Everything after that is a blur. I don't remember much about that time, but I know I ended up with the Grants. They told me my parents had abandoned me. Zoe's heart twisted at the words. That's not true, she said firmly. I never abandoned you, Theo. Your father took you from me. He had the means to keep you hidden, and I didn't. I searched for years, but he made sure I couldn't find you. Oliver looked up, his eyes narrowing. Why would he do that? Zoe hesitated, the pain of the past surfacing once more. Because he didn't think I could provide for you. He wanted control, and when I refused to let him take you, he made sure I didn't have a choice. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of truths finally spoken after 30 years. Oliver's face remained impassive, but Zoe could see the flicker of emotion in his eyes, the conflict, the disbelief, and the faint glimmer of recognition. I don't know what to believe, Oliver admitted quietly. Everything I thought I knew, it feels like it's slipping away. Zoe stepped closer, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening to spill. I know it's a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to accept it all at once, but I'm here, Theo. I've always been here. The use of his birth name seemed to catch him off guard, his gaze softening slightly. He placed the lion back in the box and leaned back against the pillows, exhaling a shaky breath. I don't even know who I am anymore. You're my son, Zoe said, her voice trembling. That's who you've always been. The room fell silent again, the unspoken tension between them stretching taut. Zoe didn't push further, sensing that Oliver needed time to process the revelations. She busied herself with checking his vitals, her movements slow and deliberate as she gave him space. Later that evening, Zoe returned to his room with a cup of herbal tea, something to help him relax. Oliver accepted it without a word, his expression still distant. As he sipped the tea, Zoe sat in the chair beside his bed, the silence between them now more companionable than tense. Tell me about the Grants, Zoe said eventually, her voice soft. What were they like? Oliver frowned, his brow furrowing. They were strict, detached mostly. They gave me everything I needed, but never really showed much affection. It was more about appearances than anything else. Zoe's heart ached at his words. That must have been difficult. It was, Oliver admitted, but it taught me how to survive, how to rely on myself. You shouldn't have had to learn that so young, Zoe said, her voice heavy with regret. You deserved love and warmth, Theo. You deserved a home. Oliver's gaze flicked to her, his expression softening slightly. You keep calling me that. Theo. It's who you are, Zoe said simply. It's who you've always been to me. For the first time, Oliver didn't correct her. Instead, he looked away, his fingers idly tracing the edge of the blanket. It feels strange, like it fits, but it doesn't. It will take time, Zoe said, but I hope one day it will feel right. Over the next few days, their conversations grew longer, the walls between them slowly beginning to crumble. Oliver asked questions about his childhood, about the life he had before he was taken. Zoe shared memories of the small moments they had shared, reading bedtime stories, baking cookies, and playing in the park. Each story seemed to unlock a piece of the puzzle for Oliver, bringing him closer to the truth of who he was. One afternoon, as Zoe sat with him during her break, Oliver turned to her with a question that took her by surprise. "Why didn't you move on after I was gone?" Zoe's throat tightened, but she met his gaze. "Because you were my son. How could I move on from that? I couldn't give up on you, Theo. Even when everyone else told me to, I couldn't." Oliver nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That kind of loyalty. I don't know if I could have done the same." "You would have," Zoe said softly. "Because you're stronger than you think." The words seemed to strike a chord, and Oliver looked away, his jaw tightening. Zoe reached out, placing a hand over his. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just know that I'm here, and I always will be." Oliver didn't pull away, and for the first time, Zoe felt a flicker of hope that they could begin to heal the wounds of the past. That evening, Zoe sat alone in the staff lounge, reflecting on the progress they had made. It was slow, tentative, but it was progress nonetheless. She knew the journey ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of doubt and pain, but she also knew it was worth it. For the first time in 30 years, she felt like she had her son back. And no matter what the future held, she was determined to hold on to that. The days following their breakthrough were a delicate balancing act. Zoe remained cautious, allowing Oliver the space he needed to process everything. At times he seemed more at ease, even sharing fragments of his life and asking questions about the childhood he barely remembered. Other times, he retreated into silence, his expression distant, as though grappling with a reality he wasn't ready to face. One morning, as Zoe entered Oliver's room, she found him staring at the photograph she had left behind, the one of him as a child on the swing set. His brow was furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't look up as she approached, but his voice broke the silence. "Was I happy?" he asked, his tone quiet but loaded with emotion. Zoe paused, her heart aching at the question. "Yes," she said softly. "You were the happiest little boy I'd ever seen. You loved exploring, climbing trees, and making up stories about dragons and treasure hunts." Oliver's gaze remained on the photograph. "And then I was gone." Zoe sat in the chair beside his bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't want you to think about what was taken, Theo. I want you to know that what we had was real, and it doesn't have to be gone forever." Oliver finally looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "It's hard to reconcile that boy with the person I am now. I've spent my whole life being Oliver Grant. How do I even begin to go back?" "You don't have to go back," Zoe said gently. "You don't have to give up who you've become, but you can choose to let the past be part of your story instead of a shadow over it." Oliver nodded slowly, but the uncertainty in his expression remained. "It's not that simple." "No, it's not," Zoe admitted. "But nothing worth having ever is." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Zoe turned to see Dr. Miles Turner, one of the attending physicians, stepping inside. He greeted them both with a polite smile, but quickly shifted his focus to Oliver. "Mr. Grant, I have the results of your latest tests," Dr. Turner said. "There's good news. Your condition is stabilizing. With continued care, we're optimistic about your recovery." Oliver nodded, though his expression betrayed little emotion. "Thank you, Doctor." As Dr. Turner left, Zoe felt a wave of relief wash over her. Oliver's health had been her priority from the moment she first saw his name on the patient list, and knowing that he was improving eased some of the tension that had gripped her for weeks. Later that afternoon, as Zoe prepared Oliver's medication, she overheard a conversation between two nurses outside his room. They were discussing a visitor who had arrived unannounced, a man claiming to have connections to Oliver's past. Zoe's pulse quickened as she strained to hear more. "Who is he?" one nurse asked. "I don't know," the other replied. "But he seemed agitated. Security's talking to him now." Zoe's stomach churned. Could it be someone connected to the Grants? Or worse, could it be Theo's father, the man who had taken him all those years ago? She set the tray down and hurried to the nurse's station, her heart pounding. When she arrived, she found a tall man with graying hair standing near the front desk, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was lined with age, but his piercing eyes and sharp features were unmistakable. It was him, Theo's biological father. Zoe froze, a surge of anger and fear flooding her veins. She hadn't seen this man in decades, but the memories came rushing back. The court battles, the threats, the moment he had disappeared with her son. He turned his gaze toward her, and recognition flashed in his eyes. "Zoe," he said, his tone cool and calculating. "It's been a long time." She forced herself to remain calm, though her voice shook with barely contained fury. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see my son," he replied, his expression unreadable. "I heard he was here." "You have no right to be here," Zoe said, her voice rising. "You gave up that right the day you took him from me." He smirked, his gaze narrowing. "You were never going to provide the life he deserved. I did what was necessary." Zoe took a step closer, her fists clenched. "You took everything from me, and now you want to waltz back in like nothing happened? I won't let you hurt him again." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Hurt him? Zoe, I gave him a life of privilege, of success. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" Zoe's voice cracked with emotion. "You stole him, lied to him, and erased me from his life. You don't get to claim credit for anything." Before the confrontation could escalate further, a security guard approached, his expression stern. "Is there a problem here?" Zoe took a deep breath, forcing herself to step back. "This man shouldn't be here," she said firmly. "He has no business with Mr. Grant." The guard nodded, his hand resting on his radio. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Theo's father glanced between Zoe and the guard, his jaw tightening. "This isn't over," he said, before turning and walking away. Zoe watched him go, her chest heaving as she struggled to regain her composure. The encounter had rattled her, but she knew she couldn't let it shake her resolve. She returned to Oliver's room, her mind racing with how much to tell him. When she entered, Oliver looked up from the photograph, his brow furrowing at her expression. "What's wrong?" Zoe hesitated, then sat down beside him. "Someone from your past showed up today. Someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart." Oliver's eyes narrowed. "Who?" She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Your biological father." Oliver's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "I don't remember him." "That's probably for the best," Zoe said. "He's the reason you were taken from me, and he's the reason you've had to piece together your life on your own." Oliver leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. So, what does he want now? I don't know, Zoe admitted. But I won't let him disrupt your recovery. You've come too far to let him pull you back. Oliver was silent for a long moment, before finally speaking. I want to talk to him. Zoe's heart sank. Theo... I need answers, Oliver interrupted, his voice firm. If he's the one who took me, then I deserve to hear the truth from him. Zoe felt a surge of panic, but she knew she couldn't deny him the closure he sought. If that's what you want, I'll be there with you. You don't have to face him alone. Oliver nodded, his expression resolute. I think it's time to face all of it. Zoe sat in the corner of the visitors' lounge, her heart pounding as she watched Oliver prepare to meet the man who had upended both their lives. The tension in the room was palpable, and though Oliver appeared calm, she could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair. He wasn't as unaffected as he wanted to appear. The door opened, and Theo's biological father stepped inside, his presence as commanding as Zoe remembered. He looked between them, his sharp gaze settling on Oliver with an almost predatory interest. Zoe bristled, but forced herself to remain composed. This wasn't her confrontation. It was Oliver's. So, the man said, his voice cool and calculating as he took a seat across from Oliver. You must have a lot of questions. Oliver leaned forward, his tone sharp. I do, and you're going to give me answers. The man smirked faintly, folding his hands on the table. Fair enough. Where would you like to start? How about the truth? Oliver said, his voice rising. Who are you, and why did you take me? The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering his response. I'm the one who saved you, he said smoothly. Your mother, he gestured toward Zoe dismissively, wasn't equipped to provide the life you deserved. I gave you opportunities she never could. Zoe's breath hitched, but she kept silent, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. This was Oliver's moment, and she wouldn't take it from him. Oliver's eyes narrowed. You think taking a child away from his mother is saving him? You think lying to me my entire life was for my benefit? You had a good life, the man said, his tone clipped. A better life than you ever would have had otherwise. Look at you now, successful, independent, powerful. Do you think any of that would have happened if you'd stayed with her? Stop talking about her like she's not here, Oliver snapped, his voice cutting through the room. You don't get to rewrite the past to justify what you did. The man's smirk faltered, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. I did what I thought was right, he said, his voice quieter now. I gave you everything. You gave me lies, Oliver shot back. You took away my choice, my identity, my family. And for what? Your ego? Zoe's chest tightened with both pride and heartbreak. Oliver's words were raw and cutting, and though she wanted to step in, she knew he needed to say them. This was his pain to release. The man leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. I did what I had to do. You may not understand it now, but one day you'll realize. Realize what? Oliver interrupted. That you were a coward? That you stole my life because you couldn't control yours? No, I'll never understand that. Silence fell over the room, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Zoe's gaze flicked between the two men, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for what would come next. Finally, Oliver stood, his movements deliberate and controlled. He looked down at the man who had claimed to be his savior, his expression resolute. You don't get to dictate my story anymore. You don't get to define who I am. The man opened his mouth to respond, but Oliver held up a hand, cutting him off. I'm done with you. Whatever power you think you had over me, it's gone. Don't come near me again. With that, Oliver turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders squared and his steps firm. Zoe hesitated for a moment, then followed, her heart pounding as she caught up to him in the hallway. You okay? She asked, her voice tentative. Oliver nodded, though his jaw was tight. Yeah, I needed to say that. You were incredible, Zoe said, her voice filled with pride. You didn't let him win. Oliver exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his body. He's not worth it. I wasted enough time on his lies. They walked together in silence, the weight of the confrontation still lingering between them. When they reached Oliver's room, he turned to Zoe, his expression softer now. Thank you, he said quietly. For being there. Zoe smiled, her chest swelling with emotion. I'll always be here, Theo. That's a promise. Over the next few days, Oliver seemed lighter, as though a burden he had carried for years had finally been lifted. He began to ask more questions about his childhood, about the life he had before everything was taken from him. Zoe answered each one with patience and honesty, her heart healing with every story she shared. One evening, as they sat together in his room, Oliver looked at her with a seriousness that made her pause. I don't know if I can ever be the boy you remember, he said. Too much has happened. I've changed. You don't have to be that boy, Zoe said gently. You just have to be yourself. Whoever that is, I'll love him. Oliver nodded, his expression thoughtful. I want to know more. About you. About what we had before. But I'm not sure where to start. Start with today, Zoe said. We'll build from there. Their conversations grew deeper, the bond between them slowly mending as they began to rebuild what had been lost. Zoe could see the boy Theo had been in the man Oliver had become, his sharp mind, his determination, and the flickers of vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. One afternoon, as they walked through the hospital garden, Oliver turned to her with a small smile. I think I'm ready to stop being Oliver Grant all the time. Maybe it's time to let Theo back in. Zoe felt tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them away, her smile radiant. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. For the first time in 30 years, Zoe felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, but they were on it together, and that was all she needed. The weeks following Oliver's confrontation with his biological father were transformative. The man who had once carried himself with the icy detachment now seemed softer, more open, as though letting go of the lies had freed him to rediscover himself. Zoe could see it in the way he smiled, in the way he asked questions about their past, and in the quiet moments when he simply sat beside her, content in her presence. One afternoon, Oliver surprised Zoe by asking her to bring in more of the things she had saved from his childhood. She arrived the next day with a larger box, filled with drawings, a few small toys, and even an old sweater he had loved as a boy. As Oliver went through the items, his usually composed demeanor faltered, his eyes glistening with emotion. I don't remember all of it, he admitted, holding up a drawing of a dragon he had once proudly shown her. But it feels right. Like these pieces were always there, waiting for me to find them. They were, Zoe said, her voice soft. And so was I. Their bond grew stronger each day, and soon, Oliver began referring to himself as Theo in their private conversations. It was a tentative step, but one that filled Zoe with hope. She could see the weight of his identity shifting, blending the man he had become with the boy he had once been. It wasn't about erasing Oliver Grant. It was about embracing Theo Matthews. As Oliver's health improved, plans for his discharge began. Zoe felt a bittersweet pang at the thought of him leaving the hospital, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of their next chapter. When the day finally arrived, she stood by his side as he signed the paperwork, his movements steady and confident. "You ready?" she asked, smiling up at him. "Not entirely," Theo admitted with a small laugh. "But I think that's okay." They walked out of the hospital together, the crisp air wrapping around them as they stepped into the sunlight. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the journey they had taken together settling over them. "So," Theo said, glancing at her with a faint smile. "What now?" Zoe reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Now, we build. One day at a time." Theo nodded, his gaze softening. "I think I'd like that." The weeks that followed were filled with new beginnings. Theo began visiting Zoe's home, spending time learning about the family he had lost and the life he had unknowingly left behind. Zoe, in turn, learned more about the man he had become, his sharp intellect, his dry humor, and the quiet vulnerability he was slowly learning to share. One evening, as they sat in Zoe's living room, Theo turned to her, his expression earnest. "I've spent my whole life running from the past," he said. "But you've shown me that it's not something to fear. It's something to embrace." Zoe reached out, placing a hand on his. "You've come so far, Theo. I'm proud of you." For the first time, Theo didn't look away. He met her gaze and smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of healing, of love, and of a future worth fighting for. Together, they moved forward, their bond stronger than ever. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it, one step at a time. You've made it to the end. If you enjoyed this story, I am confident that you'll love the next one appearing on the screen now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and please give this video a like. I'll see you in the next one.